Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. For those of you who are new here, my name is Darren and I'm a third-year medical student studying at Monash University here in Melbourne, Australia. If you haven't yet, please check out my previous video on VCE where I go through all the subjects I studied and essentially give you guys the two main tasks that I recommend you guys complete to best prepare for kind of term 1 and even semester 1. Some of those tasks are actually year long as well, so it's good to get started on those as early as possible. Also, please check out my Instagram. I share some study strategies there and also some videos, articles, and quotes that I find interesting with you guys. Today's video is targeted towards a very specific audience of Romans or people who study Latin. With today, I'll be going through my exact approach towards tackling an unseen and giving you guys some general tips as well. I think in a separate video, I may just go through an entire unseen and translate it, but because that way all the steps become a bit muddled and repetitive, I thought to begin with, I would just share my exact strategy and pick out some particular sentences to best illustrate those strategies. So I'll actually be using the unseen from my year, which was 2020. And just with my Latin background, I scored a 45 in Latin in year 12 in 2020, and I scored a 42.5 out of 45 on the exam for that unseen component. Okay, so I'll go through the entire approach and the general tips now. I'll just give them all to you now, talk about the general tips briefly, but then these will be much better illustrated when I go through the actual unseen and some of the sentences in that unseen. So you'll see the tips on your screen now. With general tips, tip 1 is to read and understand the context given for the unseen. Tip 2 is to check the fluency of your English translation. And tip 3 is to work out the sentence grammatically before checking the dictionary. As with my approach 1 is to try and translate the sentence as you read it. If that doesn't work, then I try to identify, translate, and move around the obvious phrases of the sentence. And if all else fails, I would consider the grammar of each word, identify and translate possible combinations, then construct the overall sentence. With approach, there are 3 sequential steps that I would take. What I mean by this is that I would try step 1. If step 1 doesn't work, then I move on to step 2. And if I still can't solve that sentence with step 2, then I move on to step 3. So step 1 is to just translate the unseen sentence straight away. So if the vocab is not really hard and I'm just reading it along in Latin and I'm translating it in my head and it makes perfect sense, then step 1 is amazing, works fine. So it's good to not overcomplicate things, but of course, as you would expect, step 1 doesn't always work. So then I move into step 2, which is break the sentence into likely phrases. Punctuation can help you to break it into phrases. Also, prepositions can help as well. And essentially, I have these phrases, I translate each phrase, and then the sentence comes together quite nicely. If that doesn't work, then I move into step 3, which is to literally break down the sentence into its individual components and find anything I can that goes together and try different combinations of things that may go together, but also may not. This really requires a sound grammatical knowledge, but I'm really focused on the endings here and just seeing what possible combinations there are, putting them together, trying to find the subject, trying to find the main verb, and then putting that entire translation together. It is really hard. It does require you to persist and to practice it a lot before you can get really good at it. As you would expect, there are 1 or 2 sentences like this in unseens. It's just like a maths exam. There are going to be harder parts than others. And with those sentences, you really have to get into the nitty-gritty and just focus on each word and rely on your solid grammar knowledge to figure out the sentence. But I can promise you, if you stick to those principles and you practice it hard, you can definitely solve those hard sentences. Next, with some general unseen tips, the first tip is to use the context. The context is highly important. Read it because it literally gives you a synopsis of what happens in the passage. So when you translate things in the passage and you're not quite sure if you're right or not, you can really just see, does it play into the story? What does it add about the story? And this is even better for sequential sentences that you translate because you kind of see, oh, it's building up towards this guy attacking this other guy. And perhaps you're not sure what the subject of this sentence is, what the subject of like cut is. But then the context is this guy attacked another guy. So then obviously you know who the subject is from the context. Context is really, really important. It did help me out a lot. And also, if you've done your translation or even just a couple sentences and then you read it and then you look at the context and it fits in well, then you kind of have a bit more reliability in the fact that your translation is correct. The second tip is to just check whether your actual English translation makes sense. So after you've translated a sentence or translated the whole passage, forget about the Latin for a bit and just read it in English and see whether it makes sense. So perhaps you could have found a better synonym for a particular word, or maybe you could have rearranged the phrases in a more fluent way. But you'd be surprised to realize how many people sort of forget about English when they translate Latin, and some things they write, a year 6 person wouldn't get away with it either. So you just want to make sure that you're still thinking logically, that you still remember you want to make your translation a translation that's readable and makes sense in English. So just check over that as well when you complete your unseen. The final general tip I have is really important, and this is to go to the limits of what your grammar can do before you jump to your dictionary. So really try and see what words go together, what phrases go together, and try and put the Latin sentence, rearrange it into an English sentence. So if there's a word you don't know, but you kind of know it's a noun, just say something. Just call it something, or perhaps say what you think the noun is. So you might not know the specific meaning, but you might know generally what it means. Just say whatever word that is in your head, and then try and rearrange the sentence. So you might have, he killed something. Once you figured out that entire sentence, so he having blah, 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 with blah, 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 killed something. And then once you've figured out all the sentence structures, so you've rearranged the phrases and the words so it kind of looks like an English sentence, then go to your dictionary, find that word, and then just slot it in really easily. That is much more straightforward to do than if at the start you search up in your dictionary and then you have a bunch of definitions to remember, plus you have to rearrange the sentence. Things become a lot more muddled. Really trust your grammar, focus on your grammar, get that structure of the sentence right first, and then jump to your dictionary for definitions. There is a scenario where you would go to your dictionary a bit earlier, and that is when you've exhausted your grammar completely. And also if there's a word that you just don't know if it's a noun or a verb or an adjective. You just don't know what part of speech it is. And in that case, it's a bit hard to give it a placeholder, so you may use your dictionary a bit earlier there. So tips and strategies are all really good theoretically, and they might make sense in your head, but it doesn't really click until you've seen them in action and tried them yourself. So let's jump into the Latin unseen. This is the unseen that I'll be going through. So once again, the 2020 VCAR unseen. And the 3 sentences I'll be going through are firstly, this first sentence here. And I'm going through them for specific reasons as well, because they all illustrate a slightly different point. The next part is the first half of this second sentence. And finally, this longer sentence here. So these kind of reflect the progression of the approaches I was telling you about, which is why I picked these sentences specifically. Let's start with this first sentence here. And this first sentence illustrates that first approach I was talking about, where you can kind of do the sentence straight away just by reading it. So if you'd like to have a go, please pause the video and give it a go yourself. But otherwise, as I read this sentence in Latin and translate it word by word in my head in English, it kind of makes sense. There's not much I have to rearrange. So if you look at it together, we have Titinius and Ganutius, Tribunium Militum, so the military tribunes, having set out against the Falisci and the Cepenates. Dum is interesting because the translation depends on whether the verb is indicative or subjunctive. Indicative here, so it's while, dum meaning while. If it was subjunctive, it would be dum meaning until. So while, bellum, maiore, animo are the next words, but gerunt means to wage, and also it's plural, so it makes sense that it's Titinius and Ganutius who are the subject. So while they waged war more greatly, maiore animo, so with more spirit, quam concilio, than with a plan. Praecipita verunt se in insidias. Now I don't know exactly what praecipita verunt means. I think it means to fall. So I'm just going to go with that. So let's just go with that meaning to fall. So fell into an ambush. So I roughly have that translation now. And here once I'm quite happy with that grammatical translation, I will just search that up in the dictionary and then put it in sort of smoothly. So there are a couple important points here. One, if the sentence is simple, don't overcomplicate it. Don't find things that agree or whatever. Trust yourself and move through it. Sort of ask yourself grammatically things like, perfecti, why is it ending in I? Or because it goes with the tribuni militum, and so it's plural nominative. But those small little checks can help you. And the other point is that don't jump to your dictionary straight away. So with praecipita verunt, I kind of know what it means, or even if I didn't know what it means, I know it's the main verb. I know it's praecipita verunt se insidias. That's literally the English sort of arrangement of those Latin words. So I would make sure I'm confident with that and then go to the dictionary. Now let's have a look at this second sentence here. So let's just ignore the first sentence. Now the second sentence is a little harder, and it does require us to break it into some likely phrases. There's no punctuation here to help us out, but it's not too bad. So if we look at the words, we have gnuteus, so the subject of the sentence. Morte, when you look at morte, it doesn't flow nicely from gnuteus because it is not like a verb, it's not an adjective that goes with gnuteus. It looks like an ablative third declension to me, and so it's kind of its own separate phrase. If I look around it, morte honesta, honesta could also be a singular ablative word as well, so it could possibly go together with morte, and I'm pretty happy putting those together because of their proximity, and it just seems a high likelihood of them going together. Temeritatem is the accusative, doesn't really go with anything else. Luens may go with it, but luens is a present participle and it goes with gnuteus. They're both nominative. Next, ante signa inter premores. Now ante signa obviously is its own phrase, inter premores is obviously its own phrase, but I'll put those together because they're not too hard. You don't want to put too many brackets, that makes things difficult for yourself. When you bracket, you want to do it for a purpose, not just for the sake of bracketing because you heard it works. And finally, kekidit, that kind of like luens, goes with gnuteus. So now we kind of know how this sentence is going to go. So we have gnuteus, I'll write it out, and there are some words I don't know here. So words I don't know honesta. It looks like honest, so we'll go with honest for now. Temeritatem, no clue what that is, but I know it's the object of the sentence, and that's the important point. Don't jump to your dictionaries. Luens, don't know what that means. Ante signa, before the standards. Inter premores. Premores I know means like first people or nobles, but I feel like there might be a different definition in a military setting, so I will check that as well. But once again, just a placeholder, first people. Kekidit I know means like fell. Alright, so let's put this into an English sentence structure. So we have gnuteus. This is what's going on in my head, by the way. I don't write this out. But gnuteus luens temeritatem morte honesta. I think morte honesta, I'm not too sure where it goes because it's like its own little ablative phrase. But I'll put it here for now and adjust it depending on the translation. And then kekidit, because I know it means fell. Kekidit ante signa inter premores. So in my head, I've sort of rearranged this sentence, and when I go through it, I sort of think to myself, okay, gnuteus luens the temeritatem with an honest death fell before the standards among the first people. So I'm thinking of like the first people in the army or whatever. So I roughly know the definition. I roughly know the meaning of the sentence. It kind of flows. Next, I just use the dictionary and just slot the words in. So I searched the words up earlier, and the translation would be gnuteus luens, meaning atoning for or paying for. So atoning for temeritatem, his foolishness. Morte honesta. Honesta means honorable, with an honorable death. Kekidit meaning fell. Fell before the standards among, and premores ends up meaning front lines in a military setting, among the front lines. Great, and when I read it again in English, does it make sense? Gnuteus, atoning for his foolishness with an honorable death, fell before the standards among the front lines. Makes sense in English, and yeah, so it makes sense in English. We used that second approach, and also we didn't jump to the dictionary straight away, which is really important. And I'd just like to mention for that first passage here as well, when I check whether it makes sense with the context, it makes sense as well, because they're attacking the Falisci and the Capinates here. In future, your context will help a bit more than this. Like there will be times where you are genuinely quite confused about the story, but then the context will help you out. But this is just a small example of that. Okay, and that was the second passage. Once again, I don't jump to my dictionary straight away when there's a word I don't know or a word I'm not too sure about. Instead, I use all the grammatical tools I have. I try and figure out the sentence and put it into an English sentence order, and then search the words up that I don't know later and slot them in where appropriate. Now let's have a look at this final sentence here. This sentence illustrates more that third approach, where the words are a little more jumbled and you have to rely more on your grammar knowledge. So once again, it's sequential. I look at this sentence. Can I do step 1 of translating it straight away? No, it's a little more jumbled. Can I break it into really clear, easy phrases and then just rearrange those? Not really either, because of how long the sentence is. And if you look at the endings like castra, rumor, ducibus, exercitu, the endings are quite different. It's not as easy to distinguish one phrase from another. So here I need to look a bit more at my specific grammar. Now, one thing to note with these difficult sentences is that I don't dive straight into each individual word, search each individual word, figure out the case, gender, whatever. I try and read the whole sentence, observe the overall structure, and try and split it into some easier parts. So, looking at this sentence, agre ibi milites retenti a fuga sunt, cum pervasisset castra rumor ducibus exercitu, whatever. The cum is a great flag for me. Here it represents a cum clause. Let me use a different color. A cum clause, because of the subjunctive verb afterwards. It's not like cum quinto, but here it's actually an entire phrase. So already I've kind of split this sentence into 2 smaller and more manageable parts. And this is what I mean by also, you want to bracket for a purpose. You don't just want to like bracket agre, ibi, milites, retenti, and sunt, because you get lost in the individual words and you aren't able to really see the entire sentence and translate it well. Okay, now that we've split it like this, then I look at the first part and I see if I can work anything out. So agre, I'm not too sure what that word means. And in fact, I'm not even sure what word class it is, because it could be a third declension noun, could be an adjective, could be an adverb. And so there are a lot of possibilities here, but I'll leave that for now. And I'll try and complete the rest of the sentence. I don't jump to my dictionary. Okay, ibi I know means there, milites, retenti a fuga sunt. Retenti sunt stands out to me as a passive verb. And sometimes with passive verbs, if you want to say by someone, so he was killed by or the water was carried by, you would have something like a fuga. So by someone. Here it might not mean by, but a fuga is a phrase together nonetheless, and fuga is ablative. Milites is likely the subject. Does it agree with retenti? Yeah, it could. It could be a nominative plural. They could both be nominative plurals. Milites could also be accusative, but as with all translations, you go with what's most obvious and what's most possible first. And most obvious and the path of least resistance is that milites goes with retenti sunt. Okay, so with this sentence, I have a couple words I know and some I don't. So agre, I'm not too sure what that means. Retenti looks like held back, perhaps, like teneo means hold, re, back. So I'm just going to go with that as my meaning. And then, so the soldiers were held back by flight. Doesn't make sense. From flight. So saying that they weren't allowed to leave, that makes a bit more sense. Okay, so next, moving on to the second part of the sentence. Actually, I think with the first one, let's try and rearrange it into an English translation, English sentence structure. So it might look something like this. So agre, we'll leave that last, we'll jump to the dictionary later. And then ibi milites as a subject, retenti sunt a fuga. Okay, as with the second part of the sentence, let's dive a bit more into the grammar. So cum pervasisset. Whenever I see a verb and I'm using this third approach, I really ask myself, who's the subject, who's the object? So pervasisset, who is the subject of pervasisset? I thought it might be he, someone in the previous sentence, but looking throughout this sentence, I have rumor here. Now, rumor could be a verb, a passive verb, but it's very unlikely. And also it just looks like the English word rumor. So we're just going to run with that. And further, if it is a noun, it has to be nominative because no other endings end in OR. So nominative third declension. So a rumor pervasisset, I don't know what that means either. Looks kind of like pervanio, so maybe reached. Let's just put a placeholder of reached. So a rumor had reached where? Well, castra seems like a pretty obvious object for me. So had reached the camp. Kind of makes sense. Grammar flows well. Castra could possibly go somewhere else, but once again, we go with what's most obvious. Next, we have ducibus exercitu quae caeso, etc. Quae is a highly useful word because quae joins two possible things. It joins two phrases of equal weighting. So it might be a noun, adjective, verb, quae, a noun, adjective, verb, but they're usually all in the same case. So the nouns are in the same case. So quae really helps me break things into phrases, because I know on the left I need a noun, adjective, verb. If I found a noun, adjective, verb, I know on the right there has to be a noun, adjective, verb as well. Here though, it is more so adding just two simple nouns of equal weighting. So that tells me they have to be the same case. So dukibus, the case is a bit more dubious, could be dative, but executive has to be ablative. So I'm inclined to think that dukibus is also ablative. Kaiser, once again, could be dative, but also could be ablative. So I'll put those three together. They were in close proximity. They could all be ablative, and they could work together as an ablative absolute, which is highly possible and just a very likely combination. So we'll run with that. Next, victores hostes haud procul inde. Victores hostes goes together for me. I'm not too sure in terms of where in the sentence it sits yet, but it kind of obviously goes together if you look at the endings. Haud procul inde is just some of those annoying words you got to know. So not haud, far away, procul, from there, inde. Ab esse, okay. Ab esse is interesting in the sense that it's an infinitive. So with infinitives, you always want to ask yourself, why? Why are they an infinitive? Is it because you have volo in front of it, a word like volo, so they were desiring or willing to do something? But here, if I look at my earlier sentence, there doesn't seem to be any word like volo here. And if I look at the earlier verb, pervasiset, so when the rumor had reached the camp, that, I think the word that follows quite naturally, and that tells me this is an indirect statement. And that really explains the infinitive. And that also makes me question what's the subject of ab esse, and that would be victores hostes, which works well as an accusative plural. Okay, so having done that, it's up to me to rearrange the sentence into an English order. Once again, I do this in my head usually, but I'll just write it out for clarity. And just saying it, so when the rumor, there are some words I don't know, so pervasiset, Kaiser has multiple meanings, and also, yeah, that's the main word I don't know, pervasiset. Okay, so, and rumor, actually, I would need to check that. So when the rumor had reached the camp, that after the leaders and the army had been kaisered, the victorious enemy were not far away from there. So writing this in an English form would be something like this. So cum rumor pervasiset castra, and then we'll add punctuation just to make things easier. So just to separate phrases. So dukibus exercitu que Kaiser victores hostes ab esse haud procul inde. Okay, and now it's just a matter of slotting in the words that I do or don't know. So let's go with the first half of the sentence first. So agre has a couple definitions. You want to pick the best definition. So it means painfully, with displeasure, with difficulty, or hardly. Here, there the soldiers were held back. Actually, retenti sunt ends up meaning kept back or held fast. I think kept back works better. So the soldiers were kept back from flight. I think with difficulty works better than a word like painfully. So then I just slot the words in. Agre works better at the end, just for English fluency. So there, the soldiers were kept back from flight with difficulty. And then when, rumor can mean noise, cheering, rumor, hearsay. Rumor, I think, just works better than the other ones. Doesn't really make sense to say noise. When a rumor, pervasiset means passed through or spread through or penetrated. Spread through, I think, works best when we're talking about rumors. When a rumor had spread through the camp. Now, I'm not too clear whether the ablative absolute fits inside the indirect statement or outside it. I think we'll leave it inside and see which one makes more sense. So that after the leaders and the army. Kaiser, so Kaiser can mean cut, strike, kill. It doesn't make sense to say an army had been cut. It makes more sense to say they'd been killed. Then the army had been killed. The victorious enemy were not far away from there. Okay. So considering putting the ablative absolute outside the indirect statement, it would be when a rumor had spread through the camp after the leaders in the army had been killed, that the victorious enemy. I think that doesn't sound as fluent as putting that at the start, so I'll leave the that there. So that's an example of one of the slightly harder sentences, an example of how you would apply approach 3 to this kind of sentence. Thank you guys for tuning in to today's video. I hope you've enjoyed it. I didn't really have a good approach for the unseen until a bit later in the year, and this is the approach that I developed and I am passing on to you guys. It requires practice. The more you practice, even when it gets hard, and it will be slower than just sort of blindly doing the unseen at first, but the more you practice patiently with these approaches and you just really have a system for doing things and you check your translation with the grammar, with the context, then your unseens will become a lot more steady, a lot more solid and built on good foundations. And you'll be able to break down really difficult sentences as well. Good luck with Latin. It is a subject that is really close to my heart. Good luck also for the start of year 12. I hope the beginning has been enjoyable. Leave any questions you have in the comments below, and I look forward to seeing you all next time.